compliance with our monthly requirements. And I'll direct your attention to that. You can read that at your convenience, but I'll just make some brief comments summarizing some of the information there and some of the other activities that have taken place in the last month or so on the project. Last month, the project completed more than $40 million worth of work. We'll see a fairly steady increase in this monthly pace, with the project hitting probably a peak of more than $90 million per month at its highest. That's more than $4 million per workday. I'll just let that figure set in for a moment to give you a size, sense of the scale of the project. Thus far, we've spent, as Jeremy indicated earlier, nearly $250 million on the project, of which the public sector contribution represents about 12%, with the Raiders and Stadco contributing the remaining 88%. In terms of the schedule, with 801 days remaining until substantial completion, but no one's really counting, we're on schedule. The schedule is highly complex, with several thousand individual tasks being mapped out and precisely linked and tracked contemporaneously with the activities of the project. In terms of subcontractor and workforce outreach, again, you could read through some of the information in the monthly report that we prepared that summarizes the community benefits aspects, but just a couple highlights. We're currently about 20% ahead of our small business enterprise goal of 15%, with more than $90 million in contracts awarded to 32 individual SBE firms, some with multiple contracts, by the way. Similarly, we're well above our workforce diversity goal of 38% minority and women participation, with more than half of the workforce hours being represented by minority and female workers, and about 3% by veterans. In terms of the actual construction activities, excavation is probably the most noticeable one. Mass excavation for the project is virtually completed, with more than 1 million cubic yards of dirt excavated and removed from the site. This represents more than 35,000 of those double bottom tractor-trailer trucks. By the way, 35,000 of those have gone off the site. It would have been very typical in excavating a 20-acre site, 26 feet deep, to have encountered some of the known unknowns on a project like this. You just know it's down there, but you just don't know how bad it's going to be until you encounter it. And this sort of surprise often is the first rude awakening and bad news to report on a project of this nature. However, in addition to being completed on time, the mass excavation was also completed under budget, since we encountered no unexpected conditions against which we had already budgeted. So there's a savings to the budget that will go back into the project contingency as a result of that, which is extremely good news, both from a schedule standpoint and a cost standpoint. The enormous box culvert relocation and reconstruction of this floodwater drainage culvert is nearing completion. The reconstruction is of this buried culvert, which snakes almost a quarter of a mile across the site and is large enough to easily drive an automobile through, was additionally complicated by having to overcome a major conflict with a very large buried utility electrical power artery, and all of that's been accomplished. In terms of concrete, even though the project is a steel-framed structure from the main concourse up, it will require more than 80% of the concrete that was used in the construction of the U.S. Bank Stadium in Minneapolis, which is a completely concrete-framed structure. So even though our building is largely a steel-framed building, we're still using nearly 80%, more than 80% of the concrete used on U.S. Bank Stadium, which is a building of the same size but is completely concrete framed. To date, approximately 11% of the more than 100,000 cubic yards of concrete to be used has been placed. Later you'll review the budget and perhaps take action on it. And I just note that this most recent budget update reflects the cost incurred through mid-May and restates the sources and uses to include premium seating and PSL marketing programs. It's very typical in a stadium development project such as this to fund sponsorship and premium marketing programs from the proceeds of such efforts to net them out, essentially. And this is the case with our project. In our prior budgets, however, this was handled as a footnote. We explained that in a footnote. But this has now been replaced by an adjustment to the sources and the inclusion of the premium seating and marketing programs as a separate line item under the uses at the request of your staff, and now reflects the gross versus the net treatment of this item. I want to emphasize that this $40 million adjustment is not an increase to the project costs, which have not risen. It's merely a different way of expressing the funding of the marketing expenses and has been unchanged since the project's inception. Could we run the video and I'll just speak over it. See the concrete columns supporting the first floor of the field level beginning to take shape. What's not seen is the more than 1,665-foot long concrete auger cast piles and the related foundation system which has been completed to support the structure. We just now flew over the final segment of the box culvert where it connects to the upstream portion of the flood control channel on the north side of Polaris. As we near the completion of the project, we'll repave and make other improvements to Russell Road from Polaris Road from Russell to Hacienda. You can see we just passed over a huge concrete batch plant to handle the 10,000 truckloads of concrete that will be placed on the site during the next couple of years. And from this perspective, you can see what is not very apparent to the thousands of people traveling up and down the freeway, since nearly everything except the booms of the cranes are below ground and beneath their line of sight. Eventually, we'll have more than 20 of those cranes on the site, some with a reach of more than 600 feet and a capacity to lift more than 1,000 tons. Since this video was shot on last Sunday, what's also not visible are the 450 construction workers who are currently on site during a typical workday. Eventually, this number, as we hit the $90 million a month level, will swell to about 1,500 workers. The rest of it is fairly mundane unless you want to take a glance at the neighborhood and anticipate what sort of changes are likely to take place once the stadium's completed and in operation. I suspect there will be many. I'm happy to answer questions, or at least I'm willing to.
Thank you, Mr. Webb. It's been, for the last 10 years, I've been pretty happy to have been out of a very struggling construction and concrete industry, and now I've kind of flipped back and wish I was back in it, but
it's a lot of concrete.
It certainly is.
What I wanted to do is come back to something that I ask periodically just to try to stay ahead of things in terms of participation. Is there any update on the selection or just the process of identifying a master concessionaire? And then I'll have a follow-up question after that.
Sure. We've drafted a request for proposals which will be on the street very shortly for a master concessionaire. This is likely to have to be a large company. There are a handful that are notable in the industry. And we are going to, among other things, in addition to looking for their competence and qualifications and experience and staffing and other operations, that sort of thing, be looking for a significant capital investment. Often this is referred to as vendor equity, where a concessionaire will supply concession equipment and installation of the equipment and fund that. That could be a sizable amount. We anticipate that it will be a sizable amount, and that is reflected in our budget treatment. So in terms of the local participation or small business participation in that, it's likely to be as a sub-consultant or a subcontractor to that master concessionaire, although we're not ruling out the possibilities that a local firm, even a small firm, could bid on it. We'd obviously look at their qualifications and their financial strength to be able to fund and lift that capital improvement.